July 1861, Northern Virginia. The fields around a small river called Bull Run shimmered under the summer sun. Wildflowers bent in the heat, and beyond them the air trembled with something far greater than warmth, the breath of an approaching war. Less than 100 days earlier, laughter and music had filled the streets of Washington, D.C., as crowds watched young recruits march off to end the rebellion in a single glorious battle. Now that optimism was marching toward its first reckoning, the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas as Southerners called it, would be the first major clash of the American Civil War, a collision not merely of armies but of illusions. Both the Union and the Confederacy believed this fight would be decisive. Both would be wrong. In the North, pressure on President Abraham Lincoln was mounting. Newspapers demanded action, congressmen urged the army to advance, and the cry of "On to Richmond" echoed through every tavern and parlor. Commanding the new Union Army of northeastern Virginia was Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, a cautious but untested officer. His army of roughly 35,000 men, mostly 90-day volunteers, was barely trained. Yet public impatience allowed him no time to prepare. Across the rolling hills of Virginia, the Confederate forces under Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard gathered near the small railway junction at Manassas, about 30 miles southwest of Washington. Beauregard commanded around 22,000 Confederates, equally green but fiercely motivated, defending the line of the Bull Run stream. To the west, General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah, 12,000 strong, stood ready to reinforce him if the railways could move them in time. It would be the first great test of the South's ability to maneuver swiftly by rail, a new factor in modern war. In the camps on both sides, men wrote letters home filled with confidence. They expected victory and to be back by Christmas. The war was still seen as a brief, almost romantic adventure. Officers dined under candlelight and sang patriotic songs while polishing sabers that had never yet drawn blood. Few understood the storm that was coming. By mid-July, McDowell began his cautious advance southward from Washington. His blue columns stretched for miles, their banners glinting in the sunlight, as spectators, civilians, congressmen, even journalists, followed in carriages to watch what they thought would be the end of the rebellion. But waiting beyond the peaceful meadows and winding creeks of northern Virginia was an enemy just as determined and terrain that favored defense. Between the shallow crossings of Bull Run, the Confederates built earthworks, positioned artillery, and prepared ambush points. The stage was set. The Union Army was about to learn that war was not a parade, and that the first battle of the Civil War would decide not victory, but awakening. July 20th, 1861, the eve of battle. The air around Manassas Junction hung heavy with heat and tension. From the ridgelines above Bull Run, the Confederate camps flickered with firelight. Beyond the low hills to the northeast, the Union Army of Irvin McDowell was on the move, dusty, hungry, but full of nervous resolve. For both sides, the waiting was almost over. McDowell's plan was ambitious, but uncertain. He intended to feint at the Confederate right flank near Stone Bridge, while sending his main force on a long, circuitous march north to cross the stream at Sudley Ford and strike Beauregard's left. It was a bold maneuver for green troops, demanding precise timing and silence, things the volunteer army had yet to master. Throughout the night, Union columns began to move. Wagons creaked, bayonets glinted faintly under moonlight, and whispered orders rippled through the darkness. But the march, planned to begin at 2 a.m, immediately bogged down. Narrow country roads turned to rutted trails, and artillery teams struggled in the dust. Men stumbled in exhaustion, falling asleep where they marched. Dawn found McDowell's army hours behind schedule and still short of the river crossings. Across Bull Run, General Beauregard, unaware of the full Union movement, was planning his own attack. He believed McDowell would strike directly at his center and prepared to launch a counterblow toward Washington at dawn. The two armies, each thinking to surprise the other, were about to collide by chance rather than design. By sunrise, the tranquil Virginia countryside erupted into movement. Confederate pickets along the river spotted flashes of blue in the trees. Signal flags waved from Wilcoxon's Hill, and couriers galloped to Beauregard's headquarters. On the Union side, Brigadier General Daniel Tyler's division approached Stone Bridge, testing the Confederate defenses. Cannon smoke curled lazily above the pines as the first shots of the battle rang out. Meanwhile, far to the north, General David Hunter's column, struggling through the heat, finally reached Sudley Ford. Men waded knee-deep across the stream, their boot-soaked uniforms clinging to sweat. Behind them, the roar of artillery grew louder. The carefully laid plan was already unraveling, yet momentum drove them forward. By mid-morning, the sounds of battle stretched for miles. The rolling farmland between Sudley Ford and Henry Hill became a landscape of chaos, smoke, drifting above fields of golden wheat, civilians watching from distant hills, and couriers racing between commands that changed by the minute. The Confederate line was bending, but not broken. Beauregard's troops were holding by instinct and grit. As noon approached, McDowell believed victory was close. His men had crossed the river and driven the enemy back from Matthews Hill. Union cheers echoed across the valley. Civilians who had come to watch the show waved hats and shouted triumphantly from their carriages. But behind the thin Confederate line, reinforcements were on the way. General Joseph E. Johnston's brigades, having arrived by rail from the Shenandoah. Among them rode a quiet, stern Virginian colonel, whose calm defiance would soon give him a name remembered in every Civil War history: Thomas Jonathan Jackson Stonewall. Late morning, July 21st, 1861. The thunder of cannon rolled endlessly through the Virginia hills. Smoke drifted in thick gray sheets across the fields north of Henry House Hill, where the battle for Bull Run now raged in full fury. The sun burned high and pitiless, its light refracted through the haze of powder and dust. What had begun as an orderly advance had devolved into chaos. At first, the Union attack seemed unstoppable. Hunter's and Heintzelman's divisions had flanked the Confederate left, driving them from Matthews Hill. McDowell rode at their head, sword raised, shouting for his troops to press on. Behind them, the civilians who had followed from Washington, politicians, journalists, and spectators, broke open champagne, watching the spectacle unfold through spyglasses. But beyond the hill, the Confederates were not broken. Atop Henry Hill, a line of Virginians stood firm under relentless fire. At their center was Colonel Thomas J. Jackson, mounted calmly amid smoke and thunder. Cannonballs tore through the air, musket volleys cracked like lightning, yet Jackson's line did not waver. A fellow officer, amazed by his composure, shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. The name would cling to him forever, Stonewall Jackson, the symbol of Confederate resolve." As Confederate reinforcements poured in from the Manassas Railway, the tide began to turn. Brigades under B. Bartow and Evans rallied around Jackson's position, reforming the shattered Southern left. Meanwhile, McDowell's green Union troops, exhausted, thirsty, and disoriented by smoke, faltered. The plan that had begun with precision was dissolving into confusion. Units mixed together, orders went unheard, flags disappeared in the chaos. By early afternoon, the open slopes of Henry Hill were a maelstrom of noise and movement. Union artillery rolled forward to hold the crest, only to be countercharged by Confederate batteries under Captain Imboden and Major Walton. The two sides exchanged deadly fire at point-blank range. Horses screamed, gunners fell where they stood, and the hill was littered with wrecked caissons and shattered wheels. On the flanks, Union infantry tried desperately to maintain cohesion. The 11th New York Fire Zouaves, dressed in vivid red trousers and fezzes, launched a counterattack across the field, only to meet a withering volley from Jackson's men. The Zouaves broke their bright uniforms stark against the smoke-stained landscape. By 3 o'clock, the temperature soared above 90 degrees. Men collapsed from heat-stroke lips, cracked from thirst. Gunpowder smoke turned the air into a suffocating fog. The noise was unrelenting cannon drums, shouts, the distant ring of bayonets clashing. McDowell's lines began to thin. Commanders could no longer see their troops, and orders arrived too late or contradicted one another. Then came the Confederate counterblow. From the right, Brigadier General Jubal Early's brigade, freshly arrived, swept down like a hammer. From the center, Jackson's regiments advanced, their rebel yell rising above the din. The Union artillery crews, out of ammunition, were overrun. Guns were captured, flags seized. The orderly blue formations dissolved into a panicked mass retreating northward toward the fords of Bull Run. For the first time that day, the Union soldiers realized the truth. This was no parade, no glorious march to Richmond. This was war, brutal, chaotic, and real. And it was turning against them. Late afternoon, July 25th, 1861. The sun sank low over the ridges of Manassas, the light red and harsh through drifting smoke. The field below Henry Hill was a chaos of fire dust and panic. The Union Army, once confident and singing, was now breaking apart under the relentless Confederate counterattack. Jackson's Virginians pressed forward through the haze, bayonets fixed their gray coats dark with sweat and powder. The rebel yell cut through the roar of cannon, a sound raw and wild that chilled the hearts of the blue-clad soldiers. Union brigades tried to form along Chin Ridge, but every line that rose was shattered by artillery and musket fire. The air reeked of sulfur and blood. McDowell galloped from regiment to regiment, shouting for men to hold, but his voice was lost in the noise. The green recruits, exhausted and blinded by smoke, fired wildly or fled altogether. The proud batteries of Union guns, Ricketts Griffins and Arnolds, were overrun in the confusion. Confederate infantry seized them, wheeled them around, and turned their fire back upon the men who had brought them to the field. In the valley below, artillery wagons crashed and overturned horses, screaming as they fell. Broken wheels and shattered muskets littered the ground. The road toward Centerville clogged with fugitives. By 5 o'clock, the Confederate reinforcements under Jubal Early and E. Kirby Smith struck the Union flank like a hammer. Their charge broke what remained of McDowell's control. The blue ranks folded, then scattered, leaving guns, flags, and wounded comrades behind. Men threw away rifles to run faster. The army that had marched out in proud order was now a frightened mob heading north. From the ridge, General Beauregard watched the smoke clear around Henry Hill. His lines stood bloodied but victorious. The Confederate banner, scorched and torn, rippled above the ruins of the captured Union batteries. Yet even in triumph, the cost was heavy. The fields were strewn with dead and dying from both sides. As dusk settled, the thunder of cannon faded into silence. Fires burned low across the trampled fields. The Battle of Bull Run, the first great clash of the Civil War, was over. What had begun as a march to quick victory ended as a disaster that stunned the North and emboldened the South. Both sides now knew this war would not end in weeks nor even months. It had only just begun. Evening, July 21st, 1861. The roar of cannon had faded into a low, distant murmur. Over the fields of Bull Run, smoke drifted like fog across the dying light. The battle, fierce, chaotic, and blinding, was over. What remained was silence, heavy and unreal. The Confederate army held the field. Their men, blackened by smoke and exhaustion, slumped beside captured guns and broken wagons. Horses wandered aimlessly through the trampled grass. The air was thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder mingled with something far worse, the first true scent of war. General Beauregard, mud-splattered and hollow-eyed, surveyed the scene from his saddle. The victory was his, but it felt hollow. Thousands of his men lay dead or wounded. His own officers, B. Bartow and Fisher, had fallen leading their charges. "It is glory bought too dear," one aide whispered. Beauregard said nothing. On the far side of the field, General McDowell's shattered army streamed north toward Centerville. Units no longer existed. Flags and regiments had dissolved into a single frightened tide. Wagons, overturned horses collapsed, and wounded men cried out to comrades who could not stop. Some soldiers threw away rifles and boots to run faster. By the time night fell, the road to Washington was choked with thousands of fugitives, soldiers and civilians alike terrified and ashamed. Back in the capital, the news struck like thunder. The Union's first Grand Army, sent forth to end the rebellion in a single stroke, had been routed. Crowds that had cheered the morning's departure now gathered at the bridges in silence, waiting for survivors to return. Lincoln, grave and sleepless, received the first telegrams in the War Department. "This is worse than defeat," an aide murmured. "It is humiliation." But in the South Church, bells rang through the night. Richmond erupted in celebration, flags waving, bonfires blazing. To the Confederacy, Bull Run was proof of divine favor of their right to stand independent. To them, the Yankee invasion had been crushed by courage and faith. Yet beneath the cheers, a darker truth was already clear. Both sides had glimpsed the reality of the conflict ahead. The dead lay thick on the hills in the wheat fields, and along the creeks men from New York and Virginia, Massachusetts, and Alabama side by side in the dirt. Doctors worked by lantern light, sawing limbs, bandaging wounds that would never heal. The cries carried far into the summer night. At midnight, the battlefield was still. The smoke had settled, the stars shone dimly above a landscape of ruin. A Confederate bugler standing among the wreckage raised his trumpet and played softly into the silence a tune half triumph, half requiem. The first great battle of the American Civil War had ended. Neither side would ever be the same again. When the smoke of Bull Run drifted away, it carried with it the last illusions of a short, glorious war. What had begun with laughter picnics and confidence in Washington now ended in panic, grief, and awakening. The North, proud, industrial, and certain of victory, had been struck in the face. The South, defiant and jubilant, believed that Providence itself had chosen its cause. Yet both would soon discover that this first triumph and first humiliation were only the opening act of a tragedy that would consume a generation. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln met the returning soldiers with quiet compassion, not anger. He saw the terror in their eyes, the disbelief that such a rout could happen on American soil. "They are green," he said softly, "and the war is to be long." Within days, the call went out for 500,000 volunteers. The Union's brief dream of a swift victory had been shattered, replaced by grim determination. Recruitment stations filled overnight. Boys from farms, clerks from cities, teachers, and factory hands lined up beneath banners reading "Remember Bull Run." In the South, the victory sparked a wave of pride that surged from Virginia to Texas. Towns held parades, and preachers proclaimed that God had smiled upon the Confederacy. Richmond became the beating heart of the new nation, its foundries working through the night to forge cannon and shot. Yet beneath the celebration, a quieter truth gnawed. The dead were already many, the wounded beyond counting, and the Union, though defeated, was far from broken. The first battle had shown that courage alone would not win this war. Discipline, endurance, and sacrifice would now decide the fate of both nations. In the months to come, armies on both sides would grow from militias into machines of war. Railways would roar with the movement of men and guns. Rivers would run with smoke and ironclads, and the fields of Virginia would burn again and again. But Bull Run left something deeper, a scar on the American soul. For the first time, brothers had faced each other in open battle, and the land itself seemed to recoil from the blood it drank. The idea of a single union, once unshakable, was now in question. What had been a political crisis was now a holy war of identity, fought not just for land or law, but for the meaning of America itself. In the years that followed, names like Antietam, Shiloh, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg would carve themselves into history, each more terrible than the last. Yet the echoes of that first Sunday in July 1861 would never fade, because at Bull Run, the United States learned the cost of its own division, and the world learned that America's experiment in freedom would be tested in fire.